Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, weekly national college football podcast from NBC Sports. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. Please rate, review, subscribe, all of the above if you enjoy our pod. It's going to be starting to come out more frequently. This is the Tuesday night instant reaction pod to our very first in-season college football playoff rankings. Joshua, we are going to try to explain this to the best of our ability because it's actually really confusing. It's so hard to think about this in terms of rankings versus seeds and what this is actually going to look like in the bracket. So just for everyone listening at home, we're going to start with the rankings. So the rankings we got from the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. I'll run down a little bit at the top, and then Joshua, I'll get your instant reaction, knee-jerk reaction. So it looks pretty similar to the AP poll. So it's Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, Miami, Texas, Penn State at 6, Tennessee, Indiana, BYU, Notre Dame, and Alabama at 11, Boise State at 12, which is notable because that means that they're basically right on the cusp. They didn't need to knock teams off to get into the bracket as the highest ranked Group of 5 champion. The interesting point to me, and I'll get to it in a second, is BYU. What jumped out to you immediately upon seeing the actual in-season rankings from the selection committee?
Okay, so I'll take that a step further with BYU and Boise State sitting right there at 12. We have talked about this. I don't know if a lot of people nationally have really explained this. The buys do not necessarily go to Power 4 champions. Like if Boise State is able to continue to win football games and something happens with BYU and the Big 12 becomes a little bit muddy, we could see a situation where Boise State is the team that ends up getting that last first round bye. And I think seeing that how close those teams are ranked in terms of who can get that last one is the biggest thing that jumped out to me immediately.
Okay, so that's a great point. So basically seeds 1 through 4 are going to conference champions. So those are what you said, they get a bye. The 5th conference champion gets in the bracket. But in all of the way people have been talking about this, basically since this model got approved, it's been okay, that's the Group of 5 spot. But you're right. If you're looking at the highest ranked Big 12 team at number 9 and the highest ranked Mountain West team, but Group of 5 team at 12, absolutely that's in play. So that means if Boise State keeps winning and their only loss is to the number 1 overall seed, number 1 ranked team in Oregon, they'll definitely be in play for this. It also tells me, by the way, because you have to go all the way down to number 17 to get to the next Big 12 team, that the Big 12 is really staring down a situation where they're getting one team in. They're getting their champion in, and that's probably it because of all of that carnage we saw last weekend.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And to that point, when these resumes are built and what they compare off of is it's almost like it it's a feedback loop where if they don't think the Big 12 is good and, BYU's that's all they have to compete against. It's really hard for them to try to improve their resume as well. I think it's an interesting thing. The other thing I just like to say, and I've been on this since this format was announced, I do think it's kind of egregious, and I understand how we got here where you have to have a representative of every conference getting a bye, but you look at the top of this thing and it's what a lot of people would imagine. It's Big 10 SEC heavy. And granted, if you're that 5 seed, it looks like it's a spot that you would want to be. So I don't know how many people be complaining that hard, but the idea that we have to have a conference champ occupy one of the seeds that gets a bye is just annoying to me.
Yeah, it's a good point because if you look at the top 5 in the committee's ranking, so this is the committee saying these are the 5 best teams in this order. It's Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, Miami, and Texas. So that's 4 out of the 5 are from the Big 10, the SEC. And by rules, 2 of them don't get buys. It cannot be in the top 4 seeds. So I want to get into BYU. To me, that is the absolute biggest surprise and huge slap in their face coming out of the first rankings. BYU is undefeated. They are behind a number of one-loss teams. And let's use Texas as an example here, okay? So Texas sitting there at number 5, one-loss team. Who's their best win? Is it Vanderbilt? Probably.
Might be. At this point, yes.
Now, do you see Vanderbilt on the rankings?
Do not. No, I do not.
Okay. So they do not have a top 25. So they do not have a top 25 win. I'm taking out my anger at the entire selection committee on you right now, Josh.
I know we got lawyer Nicole over there.
I'm in my lawyer mode. Okay. So that means that Texas, which the checks in at number 5, has
Yes.
no top 25 wins. They also have a loss.
Yes.
BYU, number 9, unbeaten, and they have a win over, SMU at number 13. And then, a blowout win of number 19, Kansas State. So make that make sense. Like, I would be furious if I'm a BYU fan right now.
I agree with you. I do think that they were disrespected. I will try to defend this, though, from the standpoint of what I think a lot of people are saying. So first off, the win over SMU, 3-point win. Like, again, it's valuable, but I think people look for ways to try to discredit how folks look when they win. Then you go over to their Baylor win, which was a 1-possession win over a team that's not very good. They let them come back in that game. They were outgained, which has been a theme for BYU in some of these games as well, as just being outgained by teams that they beat. And they threw 3 interceptions. Oklahoma State, that was a 3-point win. They threw 3 picks in that game. Against Kansas State, they were outgained by 126 yards. Like, these are some of the things. And then I would ask the question too, and this is why I struggle with college football, especially in a format like this where you have so many teams that come into the mix with all these different conferences involved at the level that they are, is I don't think you're necessarily what your record states in this sport. Because who is to say that if BYU had to play against Georgia, that the outcome wouldn't have been the same or worse than when Texas played?
That part's fine. That's fine.
And
but
so
they don't have the
think,
wins. They don't have the wins. So
I agree with you.
If you're basing
that's
this
where I would be
all on
frustrated.
resume, like that's where that part, I agree with you on the 1 loss versus unbeaten. I actually kind of forgot. My initial reaction was, oh my God, like BYU has better wins than Texas. I didn't even make the connection. Well, they're also unbeaten. I think it's okay for a 1-loss team to be ahead of them.
Right.
It's just ignoring the fact that these were wins. And listen, I get it. For a while, BYU was just a great story, right? We were like, oh my gosh, look at these like crazy finishes. And we love their quarterback and his story, Jewish quarterback at a Mormon school. Well, now they're like actually in the driver's seat in the Big 12.
Yes.
And we need to look at their resume and take it seriously, especially now that SMU just walloped Pitt and also has a clear path now to the ACC championship game. Like, these things didn't happen in a vacuum. So that becomes a valuable win.
I agree with you. I'm not trying to argue any of this. I'm just
arguing with the rankings. Like, this is what, like, this stuff, I always am like, I'm not going to get angry about these. They're not real.
But we're all going to get angry.
Complete, but I'm getting angry.
Okay. All right. So I'll ask you this question, though. Does it actually matter? Because they're getting a bye. Like, who cares where Texas is at if they're getting the bye?
So that's a fair point. So let's flip this over. Let's look at if you're watching on YouTube, we're going to flip this over to the bracket form because this shows what Joshua is making the point. So BYU, with this set of rankings, ESPN plugged them into the projected bracket. We all plug them in immediately to the projected bracket. BYU would still be the number 4 seed, so they would get a bye. Actually, this would actually be pretty fun. So the way this is set up with this week's rankings, Boise State would be the 12 seed going to Columbus to play Ohio State, and the winner would play BYU, which absolutely, to your point, great path for Ohio State, although you have to deal with Ashton Genty. So maybe not awesome.
Not a great path for anybody, by the way. He's phenomenal.
He's so good. I want to talk about some of these other teams that got in as at larges, though, as we're looking at this bracket. So that matchup that I mentioned, that would be the 5-12 game. You go to 6-11, that would be Texas, Alabama. That game would be in Austin. 7-10 game would be Penn State hosting Notre Dame, who, by the way, comfortably got into the bracket. We'll get to that in a second. And then the 8-9 game in Knoxville would be Tennessee hosting Indiana. So the Hoosiers also make the bracket, and they make it with some wiggle room. So let's talk about some of those teams that made it. Indiana, by the way, as a 9 seed, feels that's absolutely low. If that resume, I understand strength of schedule is like 103 or whatever in the country. If that team had winged helmets, if it said Michigan on their jerseys, where's Indiana ranked?
Yeah, I know. And I'm with you on that. And I'll take this a step further. They should 100% be above Penn State.
Yes.
Like, that is not a question for me. Where's Penn State's ones at?
How are they? Yeah, they're hosting. They're in position to host.
Who, if we want to get into this, who have you actually beaten? Like, where are Penn State's good wins at compared to Indiana? Their resume to me is essentially the same in terms of like good teams that they would have gone against and beaten. And by the way, Indiana all they do is blow people out. All they do is win by double digits. They got down by 10 points over the weekend. First time they trailed all season long and just rattled off damn near 50 straight points. Like, this is it. That is what bothers me. Like, because these actually matter in terms of where the teams are ranked. Like, this is where the meat of it comes into me, where you actually have to rank these teams properly.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I just keep thinking, I know it's a different committee every year, and I get that we're paying attention like deeper into the rankings than we would have last year because only the top 4 spots mattered. But Michigan didn't really have issues with its schedule. Michigan barely played anybody with a pulse. They didn't have their head coach for ultimately half of their regular season games.
Yep.
It did not matter ultimately to the selection committee. I get it. These are different. It does sound like they are looking at resumes more. But like, how does this happen from one year to another where Michigan's schedule was soft and it was not a factor and Indiana's getting dinged for it?
And the justification last year for everybody who remembers was, well, Michigan's beating the hell out of these teams. So they're clearly a very good football team. Why is that not the same logic when it comes to Indiana then? It is a very similar thing to me in terms of their schedule and when they started playing tough teams. Michigan didn't play Penn State and Ohio State until the very end of the season last year, for folks who don't remember. And Indiana is going to have a very similar thing. Michigan coming up this weekend. They got Ohio State in a few weeks. The whole thing is wild. It's just wild to me.
Here's where I get worried about it because so Indiana is sitting in this projected bracket as a number 9 seed. You mentioned what's ahead for them. If they lose to Ohio State by like a touchdown, are they just completely knocked out?
They shouldn't drop them if they lose by a touchdown, in my opinion.
I agree, but I'm saying like the way the committee is evaluating them,
but
they're not giving them that credit for the way that they've won these games. And that's what I'm saying. Like, that's why I'm worked up about BYU too. Like, obviously it actually could matter too, right? If Boise State leapfrogs them or something and earns the bye. But I feel like these teams that are doing all that they possibly can against the schedule that they drew, right? Like, they're not getting that type of credit when Penn State and Texas, these teams just do not have marquee wins. They're just in conferences that are believed to be very strong and they're competitive and they're beating up on each other. And we're just kind of grouping them in that way. Like Alabama being in as net large, that makes a lot more sense. They've got that win over Georgia. I understand that carrying the resume.
I'm with you. I'll just put it like this for the question that you asked about if Indiana loses by, say, a touchdown or so. So Ohio State goes on the road, which Indiana will go on the road. They lost by a point. And that's like justification along with the Penn State win, of course, but justification that they should be the number 2 team in the country. It would be unreasonable in my mind that if Indiana plays Ohio State within a touchdown, that they should drop at all. That would be the performance that you would expect from another team within the top 10 going on the road to play Ohio State.
Yeah, I am I was trying not to get mad, but I'm getting preemptively mad about this.
This is a grievance show.
This is an airing of grievances. It's always Festivus on the Rushing the Field pod, okay?
Yes.
Let's talk about Notre Dame. So this is something that I think was a positive. I have had Notre Dame seeded a little bit differently on my projected bracket, but they're in as the 10 seed and the 10th ranked team in the committee's rankings this week. There has been a conversation for weeks now about Notre Dame's loss to Northern Illinois. You and I instantly, the second they lost that game, we said, we know they don't look good, but if they turn this around, if they're actually able to win games and win out, they're going to make the college football playoff. They didn't look it, right? Like, they had to figure out a lot in the past game. They had to figure out ways to win games. But I think that the committee is saying what I've been saying for a few weeks now is that they've already made up for that. That win over Navy, the 6 games they've won since, the way that they can show that they're an improved team, a different team than they were when they lost that. They have a passing game. But again, that win over Navy, even though Navy's, lost a little bit, like, I just think it was very dominant. It tells me a lot about the team. It tells me a lot about how far they've come. And early losses are able to be overcame like that. So to me, I think it was good to see that the committee did this right off the bat, because I would have been annoyed if we had to say another week and say, well, when is Notre Dame going to be finally good enough to make up for that loss? When I think we all know one loss Notre Dame, no matter who the loss is to, that's going to be a playoff team.
Yeah, and let's also look at the wins for Notre Dame as well, because you got one over Texas A&M early in the year. They went on the road to get that done. Was at the committee's 14th ranked team, and
Yep.
then they had Louisville as well, who is the committee's 23rd, 22nd ranked team.
22nd ahead of Clemson. Yep.
Yes,
That helps
and
them
so
too.
I think that plays into this whole thing with Notre Dame. Is at their lowest point they were terrible. They've gotten much better, but they also have a couple of really good wins that they can hang their hat on. And I again, going back to this idea where, to your point, Texas, I don't know if they have the win. We're trying to justify ways to prop them up. I don't think there's a lot of justification that needs to happen here when it comes to Notre Dame, because they do have a resume that says they can beat good teams.
Yeah, I agree. And let's flip it back over to look at the rankings, because this is a really good point that I want to underscore, because this is something that stands there in the 4-team field, and it stands to reason now in the 12-team world as well. The key to the playoff and to thinking about how teams are going to get justified or excluded is you got to look in that 20 to 25 range.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you boost somebody's resume. You say, hey, look at those top 25 wins. That's top 25 opportunities. The committee can move teams in and out depending on the week there. It's huge that Louisville is in there at 22. Clemson is in there at 23, which is good because they just beat them. So that's positive. But maybe Louisville wouldn't have been there if they didn't do that. So right now, that is a top 25 win. Army, by the way, also a little bit underseeded, I would say. They're unbeaten. I get it. The schedule, I get it. But Army is in there at number 25. They could stay there at number 25. They could stay in that top 25, which would also be huge for Notre Dame. But you're completely right. That A&M win has aged well, even though they just came off a loss to South Carolina. They're going to stay in the mix. They're going to be in the playoff picture. They're going to be in that top 15, top 20 range the rest of the way, I would hope. And then now that Louisville win is going to continue to age better as well. So that's the kind of thing that you need to keep an eye on, is who the committee is backfilling, sneaking into the back of the rankings to make the case for some of these teams. And we haven't even mentioned, by the way, Colorado at number 20. I mean,
yeah.
Again, it's going to take a couple things have to break right for them to get to a Big 12 title game. But what a credit to them for getting into the top 20 of the first in-season rankings.
Yeah, and I mean, this has been said by a lot of people, so it's not an original thought from me necessarily, but hell of a weekend to be off if you were Colorado as well, with some of the chaos that happened in conference for them. And you start to look at pathways here, right? And again, this is the important thing for people to realize is I think a lot of teams right now are just saying, how can we stay in the race to be able to make it to the conference championship game? Because then you give yourself an opportunity on one weekend to fight to be able to get into the top 4 and potentially get a bye, right? And so if you're Colorado, you're sitting right there and you're saying, okay, maybe we do have a little bit of work left to do and might be some meat on the bone, no doubt about that. But there is a pathway for them to be able to be one of the teams that gets an automatic bid into this playoff at the end of the year.
Yeah, and that's another great point about SMU is the first team out in this projected bracket. Doesn't really matter because they have a path. They control their own destiny to get to an ACC championship game, which has an auto bid with it, right? Miami would obviously be in great position, I think, despite, again, lack of great wins. Certainly some game control issues, some defensive
lack of convincing wins. Yeah.
Miami. But there is a path for that conference to get multiple teams in. I feel much more strongly about that if there is an upset in the ACC championship game, or if SMU continues to win, versus the Big 12. And that's something that I think is also important to keep an eye on, because we've been having this ongoing talk about what does the Big 10, what does the SEC, what do they want out of this? Are they going to be happy with how their teams are treated, or are they going to push for multiple automatic bids? I mean, you look at this rankings, you look at the bracket, it is incredibly filled with Big 10 and SEC teams. I don't think you need automatic spots if you're going to get this kind of treatment.
I don't know how you could be disappointed. I mean, hell, the Big 10, you got Indiana sitting right there, right?
Indiana.
I mean, this is the greatest world. I know it's crazy, but talking about this conference championship thing, there is an ultimate scenario for chaos here. You mentioned the ACC, and if Miami, who would be the favorite in that game, were to lose there, could create a little bit of chaos. If the favorite in the Big 12 championship game would lose, that could create some chaos. Certainly, it feels like Big 10, the SEC, those games, whatever happens, it's probably going to be the right team. But there could be this feeling at the end of the year that, like, somebody kind of almost stole their way into one of the buys, one of the auto bids to get into this playoff. And that's an interesting thought to have.
I think we could we're going to already stealing language from the NCAA tournament, like bubble teams. We'll just say they're bid thieves. They're stealing a bid because they're also going to they could knock an at-large team out. Like there could be a lot of movement that ends up happening if a team that's ranked outside of the top 12 ends up getting one of those top seeds by winning their conference championship. One other quick note before we go, Washington State checks in at number 21. As a reminder, so them and Oregon State are in that like 2-team Pac-12 right now. It doesn't count as a conference. So they have to make this as an at-large team if they're going to make the field. They're having an awesome year, but without being in the mix for that like group of 5 spot as a highest ranked champion, it does feel like they're going to need way too much chaos, I think. So to me, that 21 spot kind of like ends that dream. But weirder things have happened this season. It is the first year of the 12-team playoff, and we do not know exactly what all of this means just yet. But Joshua and I will be working ourselves into a frenzy every single Tuesday night so that we can bring you guys content here on Rushing the Field. And we're going to have our normal Thursday pods as well. So we'll be back in just a couple days, get you set for the weekend and week 11 ahead. But for Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. This is Rushing the Field, and we'll see you soon.